Well, hi, everybody. So we are going to get started with the second half of chapter one. We're going to return to that and start to talk about the relationship between various kinds of art and reality. So we're going to talk in particular about three different types. We're going to talk about representational art, non-representational art, and abstract art. And it's important to know from the start that we may be using one term like representational art to talk about a lot of different kinds of approaches to art making, okay, that tend to all fall into certain qualities. So if you take a look at the image that's on the screen right now, we're looking at a painting by William Harnett, Smoke Backstage. This is an example of a type of representational art that's really interested in a faithful representation of reality. Okay. So before we get into talking about this work, it's important to know that an artist is certainly able to depict what they see in the world. In other words, that could be one level of interest that an artist has. They could make art out of the interest to represent what they see in the physical world. They could also make art out of an interest to alter appearances in certain ways, right? Or they can invent something that has not yet been seen. Right? So any of those starting points can happen. And we'll take a look at some examples of representational art that has a little of each of those qualities, right? Okay. So representational art in general depicts the appearances of things. So if you just take a look at the word and break it down a little bit, representational art represents, again, things that we recognize from the natural or everyday world. The things that are represented are called subjects. So in the case of the Harnett painting, the subject is a pipe leaning against a pack of tobacco that is seated on top of a paper with matches on a desktop or some sort of table surface, right? Okay, so the subject is the thing that the painting depicts or represents. If this was a painting of a human, a portrait, or a figure painting of some kind, we would call it figurative art, okay? The word representational covers a broad range of approaches. So works that depict the subject in a way that is really faithful, in the case of this one, so faithful that in recording every detail, you feel like you could almost reach in and pick up this pipe, fill it with that tobacco, light one of those matches, and have yourself a pipe, right? So it's super realistic. Some of the details that we notice about this work are not only the textures, right? There's the texture of the tobacco itself. There's the shine on the opening of the pipe that helps us to see that it's not really super shiny, but it's not really matte either. It's the wood-like texture with that sort of stain on top of it. Highly realistic through the way the highlights play across the forms. You could even see inside of the tobacco box packet, you can see a place where, the light becomes the shadow, and that sort of reality of light and shadow play happening there is really highly illusionistic. Also, the tobacco, the texture of each dried leaf, really, really, we can almost touch it, right? So the illusion to this degree has a name, and Harnett was a painter who fell into the category of what we would call trompe-l'oeil painters, trompe-l'oeil. So Harnett is an American painter. Trompe-l'oeil is a French word for fool the eye, right? So in this painting, in addition to all of the sort of the textural faithfulness to detail that we've talked about with light and color, texture, it's also important to know that this painting is actually painted at life size. So the pipe would be painted on a painting the size that it would be if you could pick it up. And that's an important part of this kind of realism, the trompe-l'oeil realism. The fact that it is life size only adds to the illusion that you're not really looking at a painting, you're looking at the thing itself. Okay. I mentioned this kind of in the description of it, but trompe-l'oeil also sort of relies on the viewer engaging with the subject at the level of touch, right? So if I talk about texture, I can say that it's wood texture, and that's one way to describe it, but there's a part of me that will understand that it's wood texture because I've felt wood texture. I've held a pipe. My dad smoked a pipe when I was a kid, actually, right? So I've held a pipe. And so the memory of what that texture feels like is what the painting is also kind of pushing at or encouraging to kind of play a role in my experience in this work. Okay. So sight, texture, touch interconnected in this work. Take a look at another pipe. Okay. So Belgian painter Rene Magritte shows a different relationship between art and reality. I want you to take a look at the title, y'all. I'm not going to read it in French because my French is terrible. It's called The Treachery of Images. This is not a pipe from 1929. So looking at it, and even I just said, we're going to look at another pipe, right? But he's saying it's not a pipe. So do you wonder if it's not a pipe, what is it then? And a little bit of thought will reveal that the answer is, of course, that it's a painting. And the title is also helpful in this case too, because it suggests that the artist is playing a kind of a visual game with us for his own reasons, right? California artist Ray Beldner even further complicated the relationship between art and reality when he created this reproduction of the Magritte using sewn US dollar bills. Real US dollar bills, y'all. So the title of this one, this is definitely not a pipe, right? So one step further removed from pipeness than the Magritte was. It's a reproduction of that painting, but the medium of money has to play a role in how we understand this painting, what we understand it to mean. So we could say that it's the same subject in a way as the other two paintings that we've looked at, but it's a different content because of the material use, right? So what are the associations that you might have with money? What are the associations the artist might have with money? Thinking about the fact that there are artists in the world that make so much money, that sell their paintings for so much. Not a lot, but some sell their work for ridiculously large amounts of money, so much though that according to Beldner, they could be made of money, right? So here we have a painting that is a commentary in a way on the art world, the art industry, the art machine, if you will, right? So the point though is that representational painting and art really has a complex relationship to reality. And I say the other important thing would be that artists never merely depict a thing, like even the Harnett pipe. It was not just for the sake of creating the illusion of a pipe. I mean, there was a story there, and I had we as viewers will engage with it through the level of our memories and our emotions and our familiar experiences, right? So it's never really just a depiction of the subject. Rather, it's always a selection and a composition or an arrangement of reality that fits their personal vision, right? We've looked at 3 works that use the image of a pipe as subject matter, but each one is only similar in that way to that extent, right? All of them are distinct from each other in the way meaning unfolds as we look at the way the artist is showing us the subject. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about form and content, okay? So let's talk a little bit about abstraction. It's a good idea, I think, to just start with a definition. So abstract art, to abstract something means to take from, abstract, to take from, or to extract the essence of an object or an idea. So artists can change the natural appearance of the object in order to reveal or emphasize certain qualities. Okay, so if abstraction starts with real things, then the artist, in working in an abstract mode, is going to select and take out and maybe manipulate, modify, change certain qualities because they're trying to talk about something or because the work is trying to perform a certain function, right? So just as there are many approaches to realism, the last 3 paintings that we looked at fit into the category of realism, right? Each very different from each other. Just as there are many levels of realism, there are also many forms of abstraction. So we're going to talk about 2 basic kinds. Works that have no reference whatsoever to natural objects, and that's not what we're looking at right now, right? This one is a work that depicts natural objects in a simplified, a distorted, or an exaggerated way. Okay, so 2 basic categories. Abstraction is common to many cultures, and the piece that we're looking at right now is a chief stool from Cameroon. It shows a repeated abstraction of human forms, human figures, and look at the gestures, y'all. So even though they're simplified or stylized, you might say, abstracted in that way, we recognize them as humans, right? Through the facial features, but also through the gesture. They're holding up the seat of the stool. So symbolically, they're showing support for the chief, right, through the seat of power. So the function of this stool as the seat of power for the chief of Cameroon is displayed in the choice of the subject matter of the abstraction. Okay. So it all works together. To kind of like get a basic understanding of one sort of sequence of changing an image from reality into abstraction. And this idea of kind of like a spectrum is the way I like to think about it. There are stages along the way. If you think of a slider in a way, if you're trying to slide the sound up or down, right? We're moving from realism towards absolute non-representation. Okay, so we'll take a quick look at this. And I want to bring back a little bit the idea of Magritte's pipe, that it's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as we look. In the 4 images that are next to the photograph of the cute cow face that I included for y'all, right? So right off the start, that is a photograph of a cow. It is not a cow. So it's already somewhat of an abstraction, but let's keep it about drawing for now, okay? So the first image that you're seeing in those 4 variations is what we might term a more realistic rendering. But even still, I don't feel the presence of cow fur, right? I don't feel the wetness of the cow nose, for example, or the shininess of his eye. It's really about those marks, mark making. So it's a drawing of a cow, and it's a simplified drawing of a cow. But given the 4 images that we're looking at, it's the most realistic one. I want you to take a look at the light and shadow patterns on the cow's shoulders, its back, and its belly. Just look at those shapes. You can squint your eyes if you want. Sometimes that helps to simplify. And then take a look at the next variation of it, which still has that same sort of positioning of the cow. We can sort of make out 4 legs. We can make out a head bending down. We can see the torso. But look at the shapes of the rib cage and the belly now. Can you see how those were derived from the original drawing? How they relate to the original drawing, but they're radically simplified and now becoming more geometric in nature, right? So if we go then to the 3rd stage that we're looking at in what is really a series of experiments that Theo van Doesburg did called Abstraction of a Cow. So we're looking at a few of a bigger series of works. The 3rd one, the one in the bottom left corner, has now introduced color. So we still see the sort of shape structure of the first abstraction, but it's even more simplified into white shapes, black shapes, and some areas of color. So it's quite a bit harder now to see cow anywhere in this, but we can see where the inspiration or the idea or the selection came from. Okay, so we're sliding that scale, we're taking that slider and we're moving it more and more towards abstraction now. And so then finally in the 4th bottom right image where it's just these abstract squares, rectangles, horizontals, verticals of color shapes, pure abstraction might be a term that we would use to describe this image, right? This example. If you only looked at the final painting, and in fact, right now, if you take your hands and just kind of cover up the other ones on the screen so that they're not influencing the way that you see this bottom right image of rectangles of color, you'll see that it's very difficult. It's almost completely, it is completely non-representational, right? So it's likely would be seen as a non-representational painting. So I think what's interesting about this van Doesburg, not only is he showing us a sequence of abstraction, but we begin to understand that abstraction is always about something. It's always about something. It's not random. So the section on Alma Thomas in your textbook, devoted to abstraction, goes into great detail about this really wonderful, interesting artist background and about her artwork as well. So please do read that. We'll talk a little bit about how this work relates to reality. Alma Thomas was the first graduate of Howard University art program in 1924. She taught art in Washington, D.C. in a junior high school. She always believed that creativity was not connected in any way to, or bound in any way by race or by nation. And she devoted herself to art making full time after she retired from teaching and had her first solo exhibition at 69 years old. You can start anytime. Well, okay. She was also the first African American to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art in New York. Okay. So we're going to take a look at her abstraction entitled White Roses Sing and Sing. This painting, the shapes in this painting were inspired by Alma Thomas's interest and love for the natural forms of nature, like leaves and flowers, how they behaved under different sources of light, right? How the appearances of them changed under different light conditions. She was also interested in thinking about seeing in terms of how she might see something through the window of an airplane. So in other words, a very extreme eye level from above, okay? So if we just take those two pieces of information that we now know about this artist's interests, and we go back to the work of art, what once looked like little tiles, maybe like a pattern mosaic, right? Starts to form a little bit more of an intentional experience for us. So I could start to see those yellow spots, maybe as the center of a wildflower or a sunflower or daisy, perhaps. I can start to see radiating patterns of tiles. So there's a specific arrangement of those abstract shapes there, right? The arrangement suggests the radiating qualities of a flower, okay? The warmth begins to feel like warm light, especially as it starts to kind of fade into that bottom right corner. It's like almost like there's a glow of light coming into the painting. So these things are not illustrations. They're not literally telling you warm light on white flowers with yellow orange centers on green grass. She's not telling us about that the way a representational painting might, right? This is really based on an interest, an idea about a thing. That's what's driving her choices here in this painting, okay? So important to understand, I think in this way, this one, because the longer I looked at it, I would say to myself, I might not necessarily need to know that she was interested in flowers to be able to see that radiating pattern of flowers here. So it refers a little bit more to something in the physical world than the next two paintings that we'll be looking at. So we're going to talk about more strictly non-representational art. Non-representational is also called sometimes non-objective or non-figurative. So not about an object and not about a figure, okay, in the most literal sense. But what it does is it presents visual forms with no specific references to anything outside of the work itself. So we can think about this like pure abstraction in a way, okay? Non-representational art takes a variety of forms, composition types, moods, and messages that are possible. So we're looking at a pair of doors from an Egyptian mosque. So this would perform a function in service of the building that is a place of worship, right? So thinking about it in that context, as an abstraction, how do we appreciate this work, the wood carving and the craft and the intricate, complex detail of radiating forms that interweave and overlap without representing anything literal or telling a story. That movement and that craft and intricacy is visually engaging enough to hold the viewer's attention and to create an experience for the viewer. They capture our attention because of their intricacy of the lines and the shapes and the patterns and the incredible skill that's evident in the design. Carmen Herrera's Yellow and Black, an acrylic painting on canvas, is a different approach to non-representational art making, right? So this one, on first look, it really has the appearance of being very minimal in a way, like it only uses two colors and three basic shapes, right? So there's a sleekness to it. There's a asymmetrical quality to it. So in a way, if you go back to the doors and look at the way the eye experiences movement there, we also experience a strong sense of direction in Carmen Herrera's work, right? And we might even begin to see a hint of a subject, perhaps. I don't know. You could ask yourself right now, do you recognize or start to see the suggestion of something recognizable in that work? Even if so, the artist was interested in shape and contrast of colors, right? That's what this work is really about. It's almost 6 feet long too. So for how minimal the number of shapes and colors are in it, it is huge. So there's a level of investment that the scale, a level of interest that the scale will tell us to if we were to see this in person. So at that scale, and even here on our screen, it's a painting that communicates really intense, vigorous energy, like strong movement, really vigorous, even agitated a little bit. It's not very fluid, right? So those things, those qualities or characteristics that kind of emerge out of the choice of shape and color here, um, are what the work suggests to us, right? That's the behavior that comes about through this choice of color and shape, okay? The experience of the behavior that comes about. So when we look at, I wanted to really kind of unpack that one a little bit more, because I think it's very common, and I felt this myself when I'm standing in front of a work of art that is non-representational. It's very common to just, I don't understand that, and just walk away. So what we want to begin to know and understand is that a work of art does not have to have an obvious subject in order for it to be about something, right? I think the best approach to understanding any work of art is to ask yourself, what do you see? So what is the artist including, and how are they arranging it, or how are they doing it? So the best approach is just to know that work, now that you're taking this class, you know that work that is about simple shapes or is absolutely non-representational can be about something. And so the question is, are you going to engage in a new way of seeing in order to begin to understand what the artist is trying to tell you, right? So learning to see, as a viewer, as we the viewers, is an ongoing process. And this class is just an introduction to that. The more art you look at, the more art you become aware of, like becoming aware of non-objective artwork, then the more you're able to practice the ability to see. And once we add to some of your skills, the sort of understanding of the language of art making, the visual language of art making, that will continue to grow and grow the more that you look and the more that you study. So it's exciting. I think, we've talked a little bit about how art can offer the viewer a new way of seeing in terms of representation, but really in the act of trying to figure out symbolically, color-wise, what Carmen Herrera is telling us, she's teaching us a new way of seeing, which opens up new perspectives in our lives in many ways, right? Okay, so let's talk about looking and seeing from an artist's point of view too. I think just at the very basic level, to define the difference between looking and seeing, we could say that looking implies taking in what's in front of us in a mechanical way or a goal-oriented way. So I spent a lot of time last week looking for my glasses, right? So that's a kind of a looking. I'm experiencing my living room, my kitchen, my closet, everywhere. I'm experiencing that looking because I had something that I needed really badly, right? So looking as opposed to seeing, which is about an appreciation of a thing beyond the function that it serves. So I'm hoping that by giving you a photograph of a green pepper with a cross section of a green pepper, so it looks like a real pepper, right? And I've sliced a lot of green peppers, and I always find them visually really interesting as a shape. I mean, they're just so interesting. Aside from that, though, it's still like I still end up eating the pepper, right? Seeing in the sense that we experience when we look at this Edward Weston pepper, right? So we're going to talk about now how the artist version of seeing works, right? What's that quality? What's that process like? How is it different from everyday seeing, right? Okay. It's more open, it's more receptive, it's more focused. It takes time too, right? So I'm not just going to glance and, cut the pepper to make sure that I cut it where I want to cut it. I'm actually entering into a looking process, right? Looking, comparing, and trying to understand. So, and Edward Weston is doing that too. So let's talk about this work. This is a photographic process that is called gelatin silver print. And the quality of glowing light that you see in this work comes about through the nature of that process. This is a long exposure photograph. This one took over 2 hours to complete. I think there's something about the intensity of the feeling of the light across the surface of the form that makes it feel alive, but there's also the sense that there's some embrace that's happening here too, right? So think about it. Weston had to be going through his day, seeing a pepper on his table or in the grocery or at the market, and he saw this particular pepper, not only that it was unusual, but that it had something in it that he wanted to try to express. So there's this gesture of some embrace that's happening there, a living presence that happens. I think the act of finding it it means that there's a sensitivity to form that the maker of this photograph has. And by extension, as a viewer, our sensitivity is expanded. Our sensitivity to form is expanded. The process of making these photographs, and this is just one of a series of many, took over 28 years for Weston to achieve the results that he wanted. So this is an awareness that goes deeper than the everyday pepper, right? A seemingly common object is elevated by this photograph. It's elevated in a way that represents the artist's wonder at the physical world. Wonder is a wonderful quality, right? The sense of wonder that would keep someone engaged with making this work for 28 years is really inspiring. And Weston says of the pepper himself, it's more than just a pepper. This new pepper takes us beyond the world we know in the conscious mind, so beyond conscious awareness. The process of seeing is different for every person. So on first glance of this pepper, you might have seen something completely different than what I talked about, right? And that's human nature. We all bring our own backgrounds, our own feelings, our own experiences, and our own temperament to everything we do. Two people looking at the same visual content could experience it differently, right? Coming to different viewpoints about meaning, coming to different viewpoints about worth, and coming to different viewpoints about importance. I think the beauty of that is that it expands our awareness of all the possibilities there. Yeah. Okay, so let's see if we can try to differentiate a little bit between form and content. We want to define those two terms first, and then take a look at two artworks that deal with very similar subject matter, but result in different meanings, right? Okay, so we're already starting to define a little bit of these terms. Let's talk about form. In the most general sense, form is the total effect of the combined visual qualities within a work. So you could have an object, a sculpture in this case, that works with material, like marble, for example. It has shape. There are elements of it that are textural, right? So we're talking about all of those qualities, and taken together, that's the form that the work takes, right? Okay, the design and the form that the work takes. So in Rodin's The Kiss, which we were starting to begin to talk about, what we're looking at is a really emotional moment between two people who are very close to each other, right? Okay, so emotional, intimate, our emotions are engaged by the gesture, by the embrace, but also the illusion that the sensitivity of the marble creates, right? So that's hardness, but we know that intellectually that marble is really hard. But when we look at these figures, we feel the sensation of skin, the touch, right, of the hand, right, or the foot on the rock. We feel the sensation of skin. We feel the softness of the muscle underneath it, and that creates a sense of wonder and engagement with the work, right? In contrast to that very sort of sensory, sensual approach in the Rodin, Constantine Brancusi's Kiss, also using the solid quality of stone, but very differently, right? He uses the block, keeps it almost in this block-like form to express lasting love. So as opposed to emotion and intimacy of a moment, we're talking about love that lasts beyond time, okay? The block is very minimally cut, so it doesn't have that realistic appearance of muscle forms or anything. It's highly stylized, right? It's abstraction rather than naturalism. So in a way, if we're thinking about how that communicates a different subject, a different meaning to the viewer, we might be talking about the difference between emotional love, emotional physical love, and the idea of love. So Rodin being much more the idea of this emotional, sensitive quality, right? And Brancusi being more about the concept of love. Okay. So in looking at the differences between these two, we started at the definition of form. We looked at stone, we looked at materials, we looked at texture and the choices the artist is making, and those are the form of the work of art. But in coming at an interpretation of the idea of love versus the experience of the emotion of love, what those two things being what each of these work conveys differently, now we're talking content. Okay. But form and content, as we've seen, are interconnected. They're interconnected. So both works are made of stone. The handling of both stones is different, right? The choice of realism versus abstraction is different. Okay? So those are all form elements, formal elements, okay? The content has to do with different, what each one communicates differently about love as an experience or love as an idea. So form expresses content and content expresses form, determines form. Okay, so we're going to kind of tie those two things together, seeing, the artist way of seeing, and responding to form from a little bit more of a two-dimensional point of view by looking at the work of Georgia O'Keeffe. She has, these are 5 paintings out of a series of 6 called the Jack in the Pulpit series, okay? So I think maybe you already know from the first few slides that we've talked about that while we understand that an artist may take a lot of effort to make a work of art, we as viewers need to also respond. When we respond to a work of art, that also takes some effort as well, right? The artist is the source, if you will, or the sender of any artwork that we happen to view. The work itself is the means of carrying a message to the viewer. So we as viewers have to receive that message and experience the work to make this cycle of communication complete. And in this way, we participate in the creative process. So Georgia O'Keeffe's response to form in her series of paintings exploring the abstraction of this Jack in the Pulpit, which is a common flower that's native to North America. So these explorations are all different approaches, different points of entry into the same subject. Okay. So O'Keeffe, Georgia O'Keeffe, just a little bit of background, she's a really important artist in the development of American modernism, so more 20th century artwork. She's best known today for her abstracted representations of flowers, although she's done landscapes and other subject matter as well. So this painting is, again, one of a series of 6. She would have seen this flower on her family's estate, her husband's family's estate in Lake George, New York. So it's, again, like the Weston, it's a subject that's around her in her daily life. Each painting in the series, as we noticed from the upper left to the bottom right of that diagonal series of smaller images, each painting zooms in closer and closer to the center of the flower. And in doing so, it becomes more and more abstract. In the 4th one, that one bottom right before we get to the larger Jack in the Pulpit 5, finally, that individual plant form has reached such a degree of abstraction that it's really difficult to identify it at all. So we start out with something that we can see in a way where O'Keeffe is sort of responding to the real form and choosing to include details of texture, the little form that's in the middle, the bulb of the flower itself, some of the greenery. So we're starting to see recognizable things, which then in the second image become more stylized, which then in the third image zooms in a lot closer, right? So that we're just seeing a limited portion of it. And again, if you cover every other image on that slide, it becomes very clear that that's more of a non-objective, only slightly referencing flower-like things beyond the painting itself. And then the 4th one is almost completely non-objective. So looking at Jack in the Pulpit number 5, if we didn't know that it was a flower, how would we sort of have an internal dialogue about what we see in this work? So I'm going to go through this one with this image here. just to provide an example of being able to describe what you see when you look at a work, and then using that as an entry point to understand your experience of it a little bit. So we basically have these tall, kind of elongated and sinuous or S-curve type shapes. Wine red happens, Kelly green, plumish purple colors as well. And it's a very vertical painting, right? So the forms grow up from the bottom edge and they converge into this S-shape experience near the top of the canvas. So already growing up in its relationship to flowers, I'm making a mental note to that. Okay. A bright white line slices down the middle of the background beyond the petal up at the top, and it tapers to a point about the bottom 3/4 of the painting, the composition. Okay. So we have this upward growth movement and then this slicing down into the lower third, the lower quarter of the painting, right? Okay. Then if you just look to that larger burgundy section to the left, we have these 3 elongated lobe-like forms that grow up out of the center, and then another one that flares out to the right. Okay. The top edge of the painting has this kind of light, sort of celery greenish color in the middle, and it deepens to a Kelly green, a grass green in the upper corners. So all of that, little pieces of color, I feel like light. They look like light beyond something. So there's a little bit of an overlapping quality that the color and the shape creates there. That could be a suggestion of light hitting a green leaf or another green portion of the flower in the background. So here's the thing. I didn't end up being able to, if I imagine myself as someone seeing this work for the first time and knowing nothing about Georgia O'Keeffe, this is the internal dialogue that I would have about this painting. I would be looking at the kinds of shapes, the kinds of colors. Where is there something that feels like it's drawing my attention really strongly and, coming into the image, the movement, in other words. Yeah, just to kind of get us started, okay? So these flowers, again, these paintings of flowers were her most famous works, and number 5 is the largest of them all. So if we think about seeing this painting, it's 4 feet tall and it focuses only on the flower. I may, through the interpretation that I just gave, I may eventually arrive at the fact that there's something about this that relates to nature. There's something about this that relates to growth. There's something about it that relates to light, right? But it takes time to figure it out. It takes time to figure it out. And effort on our part too. Okay. So we want to talk about another use of, another aspect of imagery that falls into a category called iconography. Iconography is the use of visual symbols and modes of representation, imagery that taken collectively, is associated with a person, a religious tradition, or a movement. So it uses subject, symbols, and motifs to create meaning, right? To create meaning. Meaning that would be understood by a collective group of people, or a collective culture, or a collective religious tradition, okay? So not all works contain iconography. The image that we're looking at right now was completed by an artist in the circle of Diego Quispe Tito. This is called the Virgin of Carmel Saving Souls in Purgatory. It's from the late 17th century. So as far as iconography goes, this is the symbol of the mother and child as Mary and baby Jesus, right? So we have this mother and child as the broad symbol, but then within the iconography of this image, we know that it's Mary and baby Jesus. So this would be a familiar imagery to Christian iconography, right? And so some of the symbols that are a part of that iconography are the winged figures of the angels, God holding the orb of the world. The Holy Spirit is a dove. Mary is wearing a crown. The cross that signifies Christ, bottom left, and then also the scapular garment. Okay. So some of those may be more familiar to anyone familiar with Christian iconography than others. Other details might be less familiar, but equally meaningful. So the Virgin of Carmel, the title actually refers to an appearance of Mary that took place in the 13th century. At that time, she promised that anyone who wore a special garment called a scapular would not suffer the fires of hell. Both Mary and the child Jesus carry purse-like objects that represent the scapulars that people wore or carried for protection. In this painting, Mary makes a special effort to save from purgatory the souls who may not have owned the protecting scapular. So thus, in this way, then, the work is a sign of hope, communicates a sign of hope. Asian traditions also have rich iconographic traditions or languages. So we're going to take a look at the Amida Buddha from the Japanese school in the 17th century. Buddhism is a religious religion based on the teachings of a historical figure known as the Buddha Shakyamuni, who lived about 25,000 years ago. This sculpture is a sculpture of the figure Amitabha, identified as Buddha of the Western Paradise. Amitabha here, so we're going to unpack the icon a little bit. So Amitabha is here shown seated in deep concentration with half-closed eyes and his hands held together in the lap in the traditional gesture of meditation. Right? So he wears a simple monk's robe, which is draped over his shoulders, leaving the flesh of his chest and his lower arm exposed. So this drapery, this robe, refers to his role as a monk, but it may also refer to the biographical experience of the Buddha before he achieved enlightenment. He wandered the world as a monk with no money, right? Before he achieved enlightenment. So the robe may be a symbol that refers to that. His hair arrangement is another symbol. This is typical for Amitabha Buddhas. It's composed of hundreds of curls, and it's raised at the top of the head in what is referred to as a cranial bulge. That is a symbol of Buddha's supernatural powers and that he has achieved enlightenment. The lotus flower is another common symbol in this iconography, that enlightenment can come in the midst of life. And today, artists are actually, we have several examples of artists who are today using mashups, you might call, of various iconographic traditions in different ways. So we don't have time to go into them here, but do take a look at those examples in your book. And we're going to take a pause here a little bit past our time with a couple of questions to consider. And it's all about symbols, basically. So just thinking about the icons that we just discussed, y'all. What are some examples of cultural symbols that you can think of? And what do they mean? So just make a list. What are some cultural symbols that you can think of, and what do they mean? So we're really thinking about how visual symbols communicate messages and how those messages might address particular audiences or particular groups of people, or they might address people more broadly, okay? So we have hearts in the corners of this slide, and each of those hearts has a different potential meaning or thing that they make you think of. What are those things, right? Maybe that could be a starting point for you, okay? You could find a number of different approaches to the symbol of the heart that would speak to a particular type of experience or a type of meaning, right? So if you make a list based on your own experience, you could use your book and find examples and also identify what kind they are. So what kinds of icons are they? And by that, I mean, do they, as the Amida Buddha would indicate something to practitioners of the Buddhist faith, right? Do these indicate anything like that to you? The cultural symbols that you list here, do they suggest wealth? Do they relate to social position somehow? Do they relate to a particular community, or religious community or otherwise? Okay, so let's start there and see where that goes. And then if there's time, I would love for you to consider creating a set of icons that relate to your own personal experience, right? So if you were to create iconic symbols to represent aspects of your life, what would they be? And how would you arrange them so that they communicate something about who you are at this point in your life now? Okay, so I'll leave you with those two options for discussion, for writing, or for activity, and I will see you again shortly for episode 2 in module 2.